Good evening. A scathing Constitutional Court judgment against Public Protector Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane has sparked renewed calls for her to be struck from the role of advocates. It's also emboldened calls for her removal from office. Mkhwebane lost her appeal against paying a punishing costs order issued by the North Gauteng High Court. In setting aside her report on the Reserve Bank and Absa Bank Corp matter, the court held Mkhwebane personally liable for the costs. This will see her paying 15% of the legal fees, amounting to more than 900,000 rand. Out of her own pocket.
The Public Protector yet again in the firing line.
In addition, this court upholds the High Court's finding that the Public Protector acted in bad faith and agrees with the High Court that she exceeded the bounds of her potential indemnification under the Public Protector Act. This court holds that the Public Protector's entire model of investigation was flawed and that she was not honest about her engagements during the investigation.
A judgment putting Busisiwe Mkhwebane under further pressure, but she maintains she had acted in good faith during her investigation.
I never told falsehood under oath. All the documents, we will study the judgment and we will also study what is the reasoning behind that, because our papers were very clear what transpired during the process.
But if it were up to Chief Justice Mogoeng, a punishing cost order against Mkhwebane would have been lifted. Writing for the minority, Mogoeng disagreed with the majority of his colleagues. Now accountability however, wants Mkhwebane to be struck off the roll by the Legal Practice Council.
Really, the business of the Justice Portfolio Committee in Parliament. So in January 2017, we wrote to the Justice Portfolio Committee with all of the evidence that we have in relation to her lack of competence and her lack of integrity. And since then, there has been one-way traffic between us and the Justice Portfolio Committee.
Others say the judgment will have a negative impact on her integrity.
There's a failure to clarify and a failure to submit in a report that she did have secret meetings with the previous president, and in addition to that, the head of the State Security Agency. So if you throw that into the mix and you look at what your duty is as a head of a Chapter 9 institution and what standard you have to meet in terms of your investigation, the Concord came back and really echoed what the High Court has said. Listen, you fell far short of what was expected.
Now the Public Protector says she will study the judgment before giving a comprehensive response. Abongile Tumago, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, of course, this morning's ruling follows what happened last night when, in an address to the nation, President Cyril Ramaphosa said he was challenging the Public Protector's findings that he had lied to Parliament by not disclosing the money that was paid into the account of the CR17 campaign ahead of the ANC's NAsrec conference. Angelo Fick, the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Institute. He joins me now. Angelo, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening.
Okay, so on Friday, round about lunchtime, it seemed the pendulum was swinging one way against or away from President Cyril Ramaphosa. Tonight, is it sort of swinging the other way?
Well, it depends on how you view that pendulum. Is it Foucault's pendulum, a la Umberto Eco? Is it the pit in the pendulum, a la Edgar Allan Poe? And then who is the one that is going to have that blade on that pendulum swing across their throat? We certainly seem to be living in a period where there are these shifts in the power that we can attribute to certain particular political personalities and public figures. And some of that power shifting is happening because of the letter and spirit of the law. And today's Constitutional Court judgment, people will have heard this phrase before, was particularly damning of the office of the public prosecutor as it is instantiated under Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane.
I mean, the problem is that she lied. Now, the lawyers have all said, and they've said it here on the Full View tonight, that the lying does fall under the legal definition of misconduct. That's one of the grounds for removal from office.
Well, yes, so the Constitutional Court majority judgment was very clear on what it saw as her misrepresentation, and it even used the word obfuscation at one point, that some of her explanations they found to be entirely irrational, that they saw contradictions there, and that she had misled the court system in some of her evidence. And so this is not just about the office of the Public Protector, but it is about her conduct as the, shall we say, personification of that office in these matters that has come under scrutiny in the court. And, you know, the wording in the majority judgment, and there are 250 paragraphs of this, is not forgiving, and is actually, even in the minority judgment that is in her favour, Chief Justice Mogoeng and the Associate Justice were very clear that there was, you know, overreaching of her powers. You know, I forget the paragraph number, I think it is 48 and 46, where they indicate that she had gone as far as to instruct Parliament on where and how to go about doing their job, which exceeds even the power of the Constitutional Court. And in that way, her conduct was completely odd. And so the phrasing that I think is used is you couldn't take that conduct seriously. So even in the minority judgment, her capacity as an advocate is brought into question by the wording of what is found.
Right, so if we accept that politics is a game of pressure, and there is this idea, rightly or wrongly, that she's being used to put pressure on President Ramaphosa and the people who surround him, and we can probably interrogate that, well, all night, I suppose. But let me put it to you like this. It would then fall to the ANC to take a decision about whether to allow her to be removed or not. They have the balance of power, first in the National Assembly, where you need 2/3 of MPs to agree with removing a public protector, but before that, even in the Justice Committee in Parliament. Now, the ANC, we know, I mean, it sort of confirms and denies division sometimes at the same time. Do you think the ANC is going to move that way?
Well, here I think the distinction between party and state is absolutely essential. Let us remind ourselves that this very Constitutional Court over the last 3 years has consistently reminded us that members of Parliament take an oath of office to the Constitution, and therefore their constitutional duty, and they have been found to have failed in that constitutional duty before, in holding the executive to account in their own conduct internally, and now presumably the constitutional duty falls on them to relate to a Chapter 9 organisation in particular ways. So here, how the party decides may have to be dealt with in terms of what those judgments say about sworn-in members of Parliament and their constitutional duty. And so here we know also from other people that the whippery system is often what has kept people from voting on their conscience and doing what is required of them, because if they go against what is the party instruction, they risk being kicked out of the party, being removed from a list, being removed from Parliament. So here the tensions in South Africa's democracy between the power of the party and the obligations and duties that fall on people who are members of party once they take a particular oath of office, that tension is going to have to work itself out. And I think the ANC is in a position where its own conduct is going to be judged by members of the public in relation to what it is that the Constitution requires of its deployed members in various spheres of government.
I can imagine, if we just take a hypothetical example, the National Executive Committee of the ANC meets, this issue comes up, should we remove the public protector or not? You're probably going to have people on both sides of this argument within that NEC.
Well, you have people in public on both sides of that argument right now, and I think there is a conflation often of public opinion and popularity, and the court judgment speaks of and to this issue versus the spirit and principle of law. And this is not about whether one likes the public protector as a person, whether you support actions that she's done in the past or in the present. This is about what does this mean for an officer of the court, for the public protector as the head of a Chapter 9 institution, to have behaved in the ways that she does. What consequences does it have for that Chapter 9 organisation, and what legal principles are necessarily going to have to be invoked, rather than take a plebiscite in which we decide which of the majority of people believe what action should be taken. In an administrative state, that kind of popularity has its place in popular politics. When it comes to a rule-governed state, I think popularity must be a secondary, if not tertiary, issue. What is primary here is whether or not we follow the letter of the law. And the same will apply when it comes to any kind of issue, judgment or finding on the President of the Republic of South Africa. This is not about the popularity of the individuals. And this court judgment reminds us of that. It says this has to do with the principles of law involved, upholding the rule of law and upholding the functioning of the administrative state within that law-bound and rule-bound system.
Okay, so let's imagine for a moment that nothing happens to the public protector for various political reasons. This would mean, I would presume, it would follow then that the office of the public protector becomes delegitimized. Every decision she makes, she could say that I'm wearing a particularly bad tie, she could be correct, but I would still challenge her in court simply based on this ruling. Legally or not, I would still just do it. Could we then enter a phase in which the public protector's office becomes delegitimized? It becomes a place where people lodge problems, but the findings aren't actually respected.
So that has been a history with the Public Protector's Office, and we have to, let us not forget, protect the Chapter 9 institutions from being impugned, from being, should we say, maligned, and also from being disempowered. So this was an issue around funding of the Public Protector's Office and her investigations. This is also about whether or not the particular person who sits in the chair and is the personification of the office is behaving in accordance with the law. And here, even if she believes that her conduct is above board, if there are court judgments as damning as this one is, and if one goes into the detail, this is, and when I first read it, I thought, when I did a graduate degree, my worst nightmare was receiving an examiner's report which would say the kinds of things that this kind of report said, which was that there was falsification, that there was inadequate preparation, that there was poor supply of documentation, rules weren't being followed. That would result in a failing of a graduate student. Here we have somebody who sits atop of a very important organization that is there to protect the public against administrative excess and against executive misconduct. And so it is absolutely essential that the public can trust that the person who leads that office can do so adequately. This court judgment is therefore not just whether I judge her to be competent or not. The members of Parliament have to look at this court judgment and make a decision about whether or not, as the people's representatives, their conduct will represent what the people's interests necessarily are. I cannot make a final judgment on this. And again, go to the judgment. It says, as a citizen, she may have all sorts of views, but as a person who is the function of a constitutional order, she has a certain obligation and duty to function in particular ways. And so I cannot instruct Parliament to behave in particular ways, but parliamentarians and the parties that deploy MPs to Parliament need to think about what judgments we have had, whether they're committed to building an administratively strong state, an administratively responsive state, and whether they're interested in building a just state where the Chapter 9 organization, which is the Public Protector, is perceived by the public as working in its interests and not as a source of manipulation by political interests outside of the office.
We need to also spend a little bit of time talking about President Ramaphosa and the finding against him. I mean, these findings are all separate to each other, so there's been no finding of malice yet by a court on her finding against him and the way that his ANC leadership campaign was funded. When you look at the situation that he's in now, he was very careful. He made the point, I thought, very delicately last night that he wasn't the only person who was challenging for the ANC leadership, and we only know how much money was spent on his campaign in the hundreds of millions. There's an argument about the fundings, but let's say conservatively 200 million, perhaps 400 million. There's obviously a problem when we see numbers like that with money in our politics. Have we even started to look at that problem? And obviously the political party funding bill has been signed. It doesn't seem to apply to internal party contests.
No, and the Chief Justice himself at a lecture recently indicated that the relationship between business interests and political interests is one that South Africans ought to be concerned about. And I would take that further by suggesting that the way in which politics in South Africa risks being reduced to economics, that economic interest, the survival of the market, the survival of business models, that trumps people's individual interests as citizens and questions of individual and citizen justice and government responsibility to citizens to maintain their rights. All of that has to be taken into account in the most unequal society in the world. We have slid in this direction where it is the economy often overrides very specific human rights and political interests in people's arguments about what it is that is needed to be done. There is increasingly public admiration for dictatorial states that have better developmental records, supposedly based on certain indicators. And we have, a variety of economists have indicated that actually growth is not necessarily the only or even best way to measure progress in society, that there are other forms of measuring political progress and social progress and other ways of conceiving this. So this is a wholesale re-envisioning of how we want to look at society. President Ramaphosa, of course, will have to account in the administrative system where the money came from, how much he knew, what he knew, when he knew it, and what he did about what that knowledge constituted, and what obligations fell on him as Deputy President of the country. However, today's judgment again indicates something very specific about the Public Protector's Office consulting people implicated in her remedial findings before she releases those remedial findings. And so that might be something that arises again in the legal challenge raised by the President. But that does not abscond the President from having to politically account to the people of South Africa how much he knew, when he knew it, and what he did about what he knew when he had found out.
Angelo, thank you very much indeed. Angelo Fick is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Institute.